In 1928, when Joseph Patrick Kennedy stood on the waterfront of Hyannis Port and looked out across Nantucket Sound, he was not looking for peace. He was looking for permanence. Cape Cod was not simply a summer retreat for the American elite. It was a signal. Old Protestant families had built their seasonal kingdoms along this coastline for generations. Names carved into social registers, legacies carried through Harvard, banking institutions, and quiet influence. Joe Kennedy did not inherit that world. He intended to force his way into it. The 6-acre property he purchased in Hyannis Port was not chosen for romance or leisure. It was selected with calculation. 3 houses sat on the waterfront, white clapboard, green shutters, wide porches facing the Atlantic light. Nothing ostentatious, nothing loud. The architecture whispered tradition, and Joe understood something essential. In America, appearance creates legitimacy. The house did not need to look new. It needed to look as if it had always belonged. The compound would become something far more deliberate than a vacation home. It would become a laboratory. From the outside, the estate appeared serene. Sailboats drifting in the harbour, children running across sunlit lawns, the smell of salt air carried through open windows. But beneath that calm surface, something was being constructed. Joe had 9 children, 9 instruments, 9 futures. He believed wealth alone meant nothing. Money without political power was temporary, fragile, replaceable. But power, especially political power, could reshape the nation itself. Hyannis Port would be where that power was engineered. The main house became headquarters. The dining room was not a place for relaxation. It was a training chamber. Every evening the children gathered at the long table. Newspapers were required reading. Current events were mandatory knowledge. Joe would quiz them. He would provoke arguments. He would take positions he didn't believe simply to force one of them to counter. If you hesitated, you lost ground. If you lost ground, you lost attention. And in the Kennedy household, attention was currency. The lawn outside the house became another proving ground. Touch football was never just a game. It was hierarchy made physical. Winners were praised. Losers were remembered. The boys learned quickly that second place was a form of failure. Joseph Jr., the eldest, absorbed this philosophy naturally. He was strong, confident, broad-shouldered. He looked like destiny. John, smaller and frequently ill, learned something different. He learned endurance. Hyannis Port taught him that charm could compensate for weakness, that resilience could offset fragility, that performance mattered as much as strength. The water became part of the curriculum. Sailing in the cold Atlantic was not optional. Joe believed comfort weakened men. His children would not be soft. The ocean was a teacher. It punished hesitation. It rewarded aggression. It created competitors. Inside the house, Rose Kennedy imposed another structure. Catholic discipline, daily prayer, Sunday Mass, moral presentation, order. Joe built ambition. Rose built restraint. The compound balanced both forces. But beneath the order and competition, something subtle was forming. Hyannis Port was not simply shaping careers. It was shaping identities. The children learned that love was conditional upon excellence. Affection followed performance. Silence followed failure. The architecture reinforced it. The 3 houses on the property were not accidental. Joe planned ahead. When his sons married, they would not leave. They would move into the adjacent houses. The dynasty would not scatter. It would remain centralized, controlled, watched. Hyannis Port was a system, one that allowed proximity but not independence. From the porch, Joe could see everything: the lawn, the dock, the smaller houses, the entire machine within his field of vision. The neighbours understood what was happening. Old Cape Cod families observed the Irish Catholic outsider building something permanent among them. They did not invite him into their circles. He built his own. Summer after summer, the Kennedy name became associated with that stretch of coastline. The children grew older, stronger, more competitive, but pressure leaves residue. In the quiet moments and after the football games ended, after the debates faded, the house held the echoes. Rosemary struggled. She could not keep pace. She moved slower, thought slower, reacted slower. The compound did not slow down for her. It accelerated. And already, before war or politics or tragedy entered the picture, Hyannis Port revealed its first flaw. It was designed for victory, not for vulnerability. The house had no blueprint for weakness. From the outside, it was perfect. White siding glowing against blue sky, American flags lifting in the wind, children laughing on the beach. From the inside, it was something else, an engine. Every corridor reinforced ambition, every meal reinforced expectation, every summer reinforced hierarchy. Joe believed he was building permanence, but permanence built through pressure carries cost. In 1928, that cost was invisible. The compound seemed like success incarnate, a self-made man creating his own American aristocracy. But houses remember what people try to hide, and Hyannis Port would remember everything. It would remember the telegrams, the funerals, the empty bedrooms, the silence after applause fades. For now, though, it was only beginning. The children still filled the rooms, the water still glittered. The ambition still felt unstoppable. Joe stood on the porch in the evening light, watching his sons wrestle on the grass. He believed he was building something unbreakable. He believed the house would anchor the family forever. He could not yet see that the very structure designed to secure the dynasty would one day stand as witness to its unravelling. Hyannis Port was not cursed. It was engineered, and engines pushed beyond their limits eventually fracture. But in 1928 the machine was new. The dynasty had not yet been tested. The house was ready. By the early 1930s, the Hyannis Port compound had settled into rhythm. Summer mornings began with salt air drifting through open windows. The younger children ran barefoot across the lawn. The older boys checked the boats at the dock. Rose organised schedules. Staff moved quietly between rooms. From the outside, it resembled an American ideal. But inside the main house, something far more deliberate was happening. The dining room was the centre of it. The table stretched long beneath soft coastal light. 11 chairs, Joe at the head, Rose nearby. The children arranged along both sides according to age, and sometimes according to favour. Dinner was not conversation. Dinner was examination. Each child was expected to have read the newspaper that day, not just headlines, details, foreign policy, economic shifts, political speeches, Supreme Court decisions. Joe would begin casually. What's happening in Europe? He rarely asked twice. If a child hesitated, the silence stretched long enough to feel corrective. If the answer lacked depth, he pressed harder. What's your position? And if they gave one, he challenged it. Joe did not want agreement. He wanted resistance. He believed politics was combat without weapons. And this dining room was training ground. The children learned quickly that intelligence alone was insufficient. Speed mattered. Confidence mattered. Presence mattered. Joseph Jr. thrived here. He spoke loudly, clearly, with conviction. He had Joe's posture, Joe's intensity. He absorbed attention easily. John watched more carefully. He learned something different. He learned that humour could disarm, that a well-timed remark could shift tension, that charisma could bend an argument even if logic did not. Hyannis Port did not merely teach politics, it taught performance. The architecture reinforced this dynamic. The dining room was not cosy, it was structured, balanced, ordered. You could not retreat into corners. There were no hiding spaces. The house demanded visibility. Outside, the lawn became second arena. Touch football matches were relentless. Joe kept score mentally even if no scoreboard existed. He observed posture when losing. He observed temper when behind. He observed who blamed others and who blamed themselves. Failure was catalogued. Second place was rarely mentioned again, except as caution. Rose attempted to soften the edges. She insisted on manners, on proper dress, on modesty. But even she participated in the silent hierarchy. Praise was selective. Affection often followed achievement. The children internalized this quickly. Love was not unconditional. It was earned. Even vacations were structured. Sailing was not leisure. It was competition against wind and sibling. Joe believed physical discomfort created resilience. The water off Cape Cod was cold. The wind was sharp. That was the point. The body must endure before the mind can lead. John, frequently ill during childhood, felt this expectation deeply. He was smaller, weaker physically, but he refused to concede ground. He endured pain quietly. Back problems emerged early. Illness interrupted schooling. Yet Hyannis Port did not adjust for weakness. It expected compensation. So John compensated with wit, with presence, with strategic detachment. The house rewarded that too. Meanwhile, Rosemary struggled. In the dining room, conversation moved quickly. Ideas bounced sharply between siblings. Rosemary lagged. Her answers were slower, her reactions delayed. Joe's impatience was subtle but unmistakable. He did not openly humiliate her, but he moved on. And in that movement, the message was clear. The machine did not wait. Kathleen, kick, often tried to include her, to fill gaps, to redirect attention gently. But Hyannis Port was not built for gentleness. It was built for momentum. The other children sensed it too. To hesitate was to fall behind. To fall behind was to risk invisibility. By mid-decade, the compound had become more than seasonal residents. It was myth in formation. Visitors began to notice the intensity. Businessmen, political acquaintances, journalists passing through, they observed disciplined children, competitive atmosphere, lively debate. Joe ensured the right people saw it. He wanted word spreading quietly. The Kennedy children are exceptional. But behind that excellence, pressure accumulated. The boys competed with each other constantly. Joe Jr. and John especially. Every race, every debate, every athletic contest. Older brother, younger brother, heir, backup. The hierarchy was obvious. Joe Jr. was the chosen one. The presidency would one day belong to him. John understood this. Hyannis Port made sure he did. Bedrooms reinforced it. Joe Jr.'s room faced the water with quiet symbolism. Horizon ahead. John's room was close, but not central. Small details carried meaning. The compound operated like court. Joe was monarch. Rose was moral authority. The children were princes and princesses in training. But monarchy built on performance carries instability. If excellence defines worth, then imperfection becomes threat. Rosemary's presence unsettled Joe. She represented unpredictability. She required patience. Patience was not the compound's language. The house absorbed this tension. It held unspoken anxieties within its walls. In quiet hours, after guests left, after games ended, the main house seemed to exhale. The wind brushed the shutters. The dining table stood empty, but the energy never truly left. It lingered in floorboards, in photographs lining hallway walls, in trophies arranged carefully on shelves. Hyannis Port was working. The children were sharpening. The Kennedy name was rising. But engines built for constant acceleration eventually overheat. In the mid-1930s, no tragedy had yet struck the family directly. The compound still felt victorious. Joe's experiment appeared successful. 9 children, 1 purpose, 1 direction. The house was producing exactly what it was designed to produce. Ambition without pause, competition without retreat, strength without softness. Yet houses cannot choose what they will witness. They cannot refuse what unfolds inside them. Hyannis Port was not just shaping future leaders, it was shaping fragility beneath power, and it would soon test whether the foundation it had built could withstand loss. The dining room lights dimmed each night. The arguments faded. The children went to bed, some satisfied, some restless. Joe believed he was building resilience. The house believed nothing. It simply remembered. By the late 1930s, Hyannis Port had perfected its rhythm. Summer arrived. The house filled. Competition resumed. The machine ran smoothly. From the dock, the sailboats cut across Nantucket Sound. From the lawn, the shouts of football games echoed toward the water. Inside, the dining room remained a nightly tribunal of ambition. But upstairs, behind one closed door, something did not fit the design. Rosemary Kennedy was the 3rd child, the first daughter, born into the same expectations as the others. In family photographs, she smiled like the rest. Blonde hair carefully styled, dresses pressed, posture upright. But inside the house, her difference became harder to ignore with each passing year. The other children learned quickly. They absorbed information rapidly. They sparred in debate. They anticipated Joe's questions before he asked them. Rosemary tried. She tried harder than anyone. She studied longer. She practiced reading aloud. She forced herself to follow dinner conversations that moved faster than her thoughts could travel. But Hyannis Port was not patient. The dining room did not slow down. Joe's expectations did not adjust. The compound was engineered for acceleration, and Rosemary could not accelerate. At first, Joe and Rose hoped it was developmental delay, that she would catch up. They hired tutors, sent her to specialized schools, arranged structured schedules. But the gap widened. In football games on the lawn, she stumbled where others sprinted. In sailing lessons, she hesitated where others maneuvered instinctively. In debates, she stayed quiet, and quiet in Hyannis Port was dangerous. Silence meant you were not competing. Silence meant you were not advancing. The House noticed. It always noticed. Joe noticed more. He did not speak openly about disappointment. He did not shame her directly. But his energy shifted around her. He invested his ambition in the sons more heavily. He focused on Joe Jr., then John. Rose attempted to protect Rosemary. She dressed her beautifully, ensured she attended social events, presented her to guests with pride. But pride felt fragile, because Joe's vision required uniform excellence, 9 children, 9 instruments of ascent. Rosemary did not play in harmony with that orchestra, and the compound began holding tension that could not be resolved. Upstairs, her bedroom became a different world. Soft light, religious statues near the bedside, books she struggled to read, notes written carefully in uneven handwriting. It was the quietest room in the house. Sometimes from her window she watched her siblings racing across the lawn. She wanted to join fully, but participation required speed, and speed required something she could not manufacture. Joe feared something deeper than embarrassment. He feared vulnerability. The Kennedy name was rising. Joe was entering national politics. He had become ambassador to Britain in 1937. The family was no longer private. Weakness could be weaponized. And Rosemary, in Joe's mind, represented unpredictable weakness. Accounts differ on when his anxiety turned into calculation. But by 1940, Rosemary's behaviour reportedly became more erratic. Some historians argue this was exaggerated. Others suggest she experienced mood swings, frustration, perhaps depression from living inside constant comparison. What is clear is this: Hyannis Port was not built to nurture fragility. It was built to eliminate it. In 1941, Joe made a decision. A medical procedure had gained attention in certain circles, prefrontal lobotomy. It was presented as modern science, a treatment for emotional instability, an innovation that could calm agitation and improve behaviour. The risks were enormous, the long-term consequences largely unknown. But Joe was not seeking medical nuance. He was seeking control. He arranged the procedure quietly. Accounts suggest Rose was not fully informed of its severity. Some say she was told little. Others say she was told it was minor. What is undisputed is that in November 1941, Rosemary entered George Washington University Hospital for the operation. She was 23. During the procedure, surgeons kept her conscious. They asked her to recite prayers, to sing, to speak. When her speech faltered and coherence faded, they stopped. The operation was considered complete. When Rosemary emerged, she was not calmer. She was diminished. Her mental capacity reduced dramatically. Speech impaired. Motor coordination weakened. Independence erased. Joe had sought improvement. Instead, he created permanent silence. She was moved to institutions, first in New York, later to St. Coletta School in Wisconsin, where she would remain for the rest of her life. Hyannis Port did not speak of it. Her bedroom remained for a time. Then it was closed. Guests were told she was working in education. The narrative was adjusted. The house absorbed the secret. It became the first true fracture within the compound's mythology. Rose suffered privately. She visited less often than she wished. But within the Kennedy structure, Joe's decisions were rarely publicly challenged. The other children were discouraged from discussing it. Some did not fully understand for years. Rosemary became a ghost in her own family, alive but absent, and the house remembered. The silence upstairs was heavier than any argument in the dining room. The lawn continued hosting football games. The dock still echoed with laughter. The dining table still held debate. But something fundamental had shifted. Hyannis Port had sacrificed one of its own, not to tragedy, but to perfection. Joe believed he had protected the dynasty. He had eliminated vulnerability. But the cost was invisible damage, because ambition without compassion does not strengthen foundations, it weakens them quietly. Rosemary lived until 2005. She survived decades beyond many of her siblings, but she never returned to the compound as she once knew it. Her room no longer belonged to her. It belonged to memory. Hyannis Port had proven something crucial. It would preserve image at any cost, even at the cost of a daughter. The machine did not malfunction. It recalibrated. But recalibration leaves scars, and the house, silent and white against the Atlantic sky, held its first permanent one. By the early 1940s, the Kennedy compound in Hyannis Port had already absorbed silence. Rosemary's absence lingered in hallways that once echoed with her slower footsteps. Her name was rarely spoken at dinner. The machine had adjusted. It always adjusted. But war does not negotiate with private ambition. And in 1944, Hyannis Port received its first telegram of irreversible loss. The war had reshaped America. Pearl Harbor ended isolation. Sons across the country enlisted. The Kennedy sons were no exception. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., the heir, the chosen one, joined the Navy. He trained as a pilot, strong, disciplined, confident. He looked exactly like the future Joe had imagined. John joined too, sickly John, the second son, the backup. He commanded a patrol torpedo boat in the Pacific. Joe watched this unfold from Hyannis Port with complex calculation. Military service was sacrifice, yes, but it was also narrative. War heroes became senators, senators became presidents. The dynasty's path simply shifted terrain. In August 1943, John's PT-109 was rammed by a Japanese destroyer. The boat split in half. 2 men died instantly. John swam for hours in dark water, towing an injured crew member by gripping the strap of his life vest between his teeth. He saved lives. He became a hero. The story spread. Joe ensured it did. Newspapers praised the young officer. Hyannis Port glowed with reflected pride. But pride inside that house always required balance. If John had become heroic, then Joseph Jr. needed to exceed him, because the dining room hierarchy still mattered, because Joe Jr. had always been the chosen one, and Hyannis Port had trained him to win. In August 1944, Joseph Jr. volunteered for Operation Aphrodite, an experimental mission involving bombers loaded with explosives. Pilots would arm the explosives mid-air, set autopilot and parachute out before detonation. It was dangerous, almost reckless, but it promised distinction, and distinction was oxygen in the Kennedy household. On August 12, 1944, Joseph Jr.'s plane exploded mid-air over England. There was no dramatic final message, no last words. The aircraft disintegrated completely, nothing recoverable. The next day, a Western Union messenger approached the main house in Hyannis Port. The compound was in summer mode, windows open, the ocean bright, children moving between rooms. Joe answered the door. He opened the telegram. The words were brief, official, final. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr. was dead. For a moment the engine stopped. Rose was at church. She returned to find Joe standing in the main room, telegram in hand. The heir was gone. The future president, the firstborn son, the one the compound had been built around. The house shifted. The main living room, once echoing with argument and ambition, became a place of stillness. Joe Jr.'s bedroom remained untouched. His trophies sat in place. His photographs leaned against walls. The bed unmade as if he would return. Joe could not close the door, because closing the door would mean acknowledging finality. Hyannis Port had trained for victory. It had not trained for burial. The dining table felt different. John now sat in the chair that had belonged to second place, and the weight of expectation moved. Joe's gaze followed him more closely. The dynasty could not collapse. One son remained capable. The machine recalibrated again. John was no longer backup. He was the vessel, but recalibration cannot erase grief. Rose leaned into faith more deeply. Mass became daily refuge. Prayer became repetition against despair. Joe grew quieter, not softer, just quieter. He had built a system of relentless ambition. Now that ambition had sent his son into a mission designed to prove superiority, and it had killed him. Hyannis Port absorbed the irony. The lawn where Joe Jr. had dominated football games stood empty. The dock where he once raced his brothers remained still at dusk. The Atlantic continued its rhythm, indifferent. The house did not mourn. It contained mourning. Visitors arrived offering condolences. Political associates who once envisioned partnership with Joe Jr. now spoke carefully to John. John felt it, the shift. He had lived his entire life in the shadow of his older brother. Now he stood in his absence, and absence is heavier than shadow. Joe began shaping John more aggressively. The presidency still remained the objective. Joe Jr.'s death did not diminish the goal. It intensified it. The compound's purpose did not change, it narrowed. Hyannis Port had lost one son, but the dynasty must proceed. Even in grief, ambition continued, and that is what transformed the house permanently. It was no longer simply training ground. It was memorial, a place where laughter coexisted with telegrams, where bedrooms preserved ghosts, where success and death became neighbours. And this would not be the last telegram. The house had now tasted irreversible loss, and something in its air had altered. Because once tragedy enters architecture, it does not leave, it settles, it waits. If Hyannis Port was the training ground, Palm Beach was the performance stage. By 1933, America was collapsing into the Great Depression. Banks were shuttered, fortunes evaporated, mansions along the Atlantic coast stood half-staffed, their owners forced to sell estates built in the roaring optimism of the 1920s. Joseph Kennedy did not suffer. He had exited the stock market before the crash. Where others saw ruin, he saw opportunity. And in Palm Beach, he found La Guarida. The estate sat on North Ocean Boulevard, the most prestigious strip of sand in Florida. Mediterranean revival architecture, white stucco walls, arched windows, red-tiled roof, symmetrical gardens designed to imply European inheritance. It looked old, it looked continental, it looked aristocratic. That was the point. Joe purchased it at a fraction of its pre-crash price. Hyannis Port had inserted him into old New England society. Palm Beach would insert him into national wealth. The architecture contrasted Cape Cod entirely, where Hyannis was restrained, Protestant in aesthetic, whispering tradition. La Guarida was theatrical. Sunlight poured into arched corridors. Palm trees framed ocean views. The Atlantic here was warm, not punishing. It was leisure disguised as legacy. But even here, Joe was not seeking rest. Palm Beach was useful for two reasons. First, privacy. Cape Cod was small. Eyes were always watching. Old families monitored newcomers carefully. Palm Beach estates were gated, landscaped for seclusion. Walls and hedges created invisibility. Deals could be made quietly. Second, positioning. Winter society in Palm Beach included banking magnates, industrial dynasties, national figures of influence. It was not regional power, it was federal scale. Joe's children would not only be seen as Boston Catholics, they would be seen as national elites. Rose adapted the household accordingly. Where Hyannis emphasized competition, Palm Beach emphasized elegance. Dinner parties were curated carefully, clothing more refined, conversation more polished. The children were expected to move smoothly between worlds. Rough athleticism in Massachusetts, cultivated sophistication in Florida, two estates, two identities, one objective. But something subtle shifted in Palm Beach. Hyannis demanded endurance. Palm Beach encouraged illusion. La Guarida's interior was larger, grander, the ceilings higher, the light brighter. Yet inside its rooms the same expectations followed. Joe Jr. was still heir, John still backup, Rosemary still struggling. But here, Rosemary's limitations felt sharper. Formal social events required grace. Conversation required fluidity. Her difficulties became more visible against polished surroundings. Joe grew increasingly anxious. The family's image was expanding. Exposure meant scrutiny, and scrutiny magnified weakness. Palm Beach intensified Joe's obsession with control. He hosted businessmen privately. He cultivated relationships strategically. The estate became winter headquarters of ambition. Even leisure was political. Visitors were assessed for usefulness. Conversations were investments. And the children observed. They learned that architecture could manipulate perception, that the right setting reframed identity. La Guarida offered sunlit glamour. Hyannis offered disciplined legitimacy. Together they constructed narrative, but narrative requires suppression. Rosemary's eventual institutionalization would not have been decided in Hyannis alone. Palm Beach reinforced the urgency of perfection. Here, among America's wealthiest families, deviation felt intolerable. La Guarida witnessed the private conversations, the calculated reasoning, the medical consultations discussed in controlled tones, the desire to eliminate unpredictability. If Hyannis was the engine, Palm Beach was the mirror. It reflected the dynasty as Joe wanted it seen. And mirrors can distort. By 1937, Joe's appointment as ambassador to Britain elevated the family further. Palm Beach became symbolic of national ascent. An Irish Catholic from Boston now representing the United States abroad. The outsider had entered the palace, but Joe's ambassadorship ended in controversy. His public comments about European politics damaged his reputation. He resigned in 1940, and La Guarida transformed into refuge, a place where Joe retreated when Washington turned hostile. Palm Beach absorbed disappointment quietly. Unlike Hyannis, which carried emotional history, La Guarida carried strategic recalculation. Here, Joe focused fully on the next phase, the sons. The dynasty would not depend on his own political career, it would rise through them. La Guarida's warm air could not soften that ambition. Even by the pool, the tone remained deliberate. The daughters attended social gatherings, the sons built networks. Joe observed constantly. The estate seemed tranquil, ocean waves lapping softly, palm shadows stretching across stone terraces. But beneath that calm was relentless recalibration. 2 estates, 2 stages, 1 dynasty. Yet both houses shared a flaw. They believed environment could engineer destiny. They assumed that with enough pressure, enough positioning, enough calculated exposure, success would be inevitable. But environment cannot shield against mortality. Palm Beach would later feel the weight of Joe's stroke. It would witness the physical collapse of the patriarch who built both worlds. And it would stand as winter reminder that glamour cannot prevent decline. La Guarida never held the raw grief Hyannis would. But it held something equally revealing, the illusion that image equals security. In its bright corridors, Joe believed he had mastered perception. He believed architecture could grant permanence. But houses do not guarantee survival. They only stage it. And Palm Beach, with all its sunlight and Mediterranean elegance, was merely another theatre where ambition rehearsed, unaware of the tragedies still approaching. Hyannis Port demanded loyalty. Palm Beach demanded performance. But neither allowed independence without consequence. Kathleen Kennedy, known to everyone as Kick, understood this earlier than the others. She'd grown up inside the same architecture of expectation. She ran across the same lawns, sat at the same dining table, endured the same competitive scrutiny. But she absorbed it differently. Where Joseph Jr. internalized ambition and John internalized resilience, Kick internalized escape. She was magnetic, warm, socially fearless, at ease in conversation. She did not dominate rooms like her father, she animated them. Hyannis Port loved her energy, but it did not own her spirit. When Joe became ambassador to Britain in 1937, Kick moved to London with the family. The shift changed her permanently. England was not Hyannis Port. It was aristocratic, ancient, layered with tradition far older than Cape Cod society. And in that world she met William Cavendish, heir to the Duke of Devonshire. He came from Chatsworth House, an estate that dwarfed Hyannis in scale and history. He was Protestant, she was Catholic. In the Kennedy household that difference was not small. Rose Kennedy believed deeply in Catholic doctrine. Marrying outside the church was unthinkable. It meant religious betrayal. It meant rupture. Joe viewed it differently. He saw advantage. An alliance with British aristocracy elevated the Kennedy image beyond American wealth. But Rose saw something else. Loss of spiritual control. Kick fell in love. Not strategically, not politically, personally. And that distinction mattered. When she decided to marry William in 1944, Rose refused to attend the ceremony. The wedding was civil, not Catholic. Kick chose love over doctrine. Hyannis Port felt the defiance. The compound that demanded conformity had produced its first open rebellion. But fate moved faster than reconciliation. 4 months later, William was killed in combat in Belgium. Kick became a widow at 24. The telegram reached the family again. Another son-in-law lost to war. Another absence registered inside Hyannis. Joe and Rose urged her to return home, to come back to the compound, back into orbit. But Kick stayed in England. She felt more at home among the Cavendish family than she did within the rigid structures of Hyannis. For the first time, a Kennedy child was choosing identity beyond the compound. Hyannis Port interpreted distance as danger. Because the Kennedy doctrine had quietly formed. The house is safety. Leaving is risk. And risk leads to loss. Kick's independence intensified when she began a relationship with Peter Fitzwilliam, a wealthy English aristocrat, and married. Separated, but not divorced. The situation scandalized both the Cavendish family and her own. Joe was furious. not because of morality, but because of optics. John's political career was rising, scandal was combustible, Hyannis Port could not afford unpredictability. Joe reportedly threatened to cut her off financially if she continued. Choose the dynasty, or choose your own life. Kik chose her own life. In May 1948, she and Peter chartered a small plane to fly to the south of France. The weather was poor, the pilot warned of storms, they flew anyway. Somewhere over the French Alps, the plane crashed into a mountain. There were no survivors, another telegram, another death that felt preventable. Hyannis Port absorbed it differently this time. Joe did not attend her funeral. Roses did not attend. The official explanation involved travel difficulties, but many believed the absence symbolised unresolved disapproval. Kik was buried in England, in the Cavendish family plot, not at home. Her bedroom at Hyannis fell silent. Unlike Rosemary, who was hidden, unlike Joe Jr., who was memorialised, Kik was something else. She was warning. The daughter who stepped outside the compound and died. Hyannis Port absorbed a new narrative. Stay close, obey structure. Deviation leads to disaster. Whether coincidence or projection, the belief solidified. 2 empty chairs now marked the dining table. One for Joe Jr., one for Kik. The compound, once loud with 9 children, felt thinner, less crowded. The architecture remained unchanged. White siding, green shutters, Atlantic breeze, but internally it carried ghosts. The house had now witnessed institutionalization and 2 deaths, and yet the dynasty pressed forward. John was rising in politics. Robert was emerging as strategist. Ted was young but promising. The machine recalibrated again. Loss did not halt ambition, it intensified it. Because now success felt necessary to justify sacrifice. Hyannis Port began shifting from laboratory to memorial. Its rooms carried more memory than laughter, and still, from the outside, it looked ideal. That was its genius. It concealed fracture beneath symmetry. It projected strength while containing sorrow. Kik had chosen freedom. The house chose narrative, and narrative always wins inside dynasties. The Atlantic continued to rise and fall against the shore, unaware of rebellion, unaware of regret. Hyannis Port stood firm, but beneath its floorboards ambition had begun to taste mortality, and mortality would not leave quietly. By the late 1950s, Hyannis Port was no longer just a family compound, it was becoming myth. The white clapboard houses that Joseph Kennedy had purchased 3 decades earlier, once symbols of forced entry into elite society, were now central to something larger. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was rising, first congressman, then senator, young, charismatic, photogenic. The compound that had trained him was about to be projected onto the world. When John won the presidency in November 1960, Hyannis Port transformed overnight. It was no longer merely a private estate. It became the summer White House. The change was physical. Secret Service agents flooded the property. Communication lines were installed. Security perimeters were drawn. Coast Guard boats patrolled offshore waters. Helicopters landed on the lawn. The compound that once hosted competitive football games now hosted national security briefings. The porch that once framed Joe watching his children compete now framed a president addressing a nation. But architecture does not change its memory. Hyannis Port still held the echoes of Rosemary's absence, Joe Jr.'s preserved bedroom, Kik's empty chair, and now it held something else, global attention. Photographers stationed themselves outside the gates, telephoto lenses aimed toward the dock, every movement documented, John sailing, John jogging on the beach, John playing touch football with his brothers. The imagery was powerful, youth, energy, American royalty. The press began calling it Camelot. Hyannis Port became the visual heart of that illusion. The house was no longer simply engine, it was stage. Jacqueline Kennedy stepped into that stage reluctantly. She had never fully embraced the compound's culture. She found the competition childish, the noise exhausting, the lack of privacy suffocating. Now it was worse, every smile measured, every dress analysed, every vacation photographed. At Hyannis Port there was nowhere to disappear. The house amplified performance. It demanded unity. It demanded image. Jackie retreated when she could. But summers at the compound were expected. They were politically useful. The American public loved seeing the president with his family by the sea. It made power feel human. The dock became symbol. The rocking chair on the porch became icon. John's back pain required specialized seating, and the rocking chair, placed against the Atlantic backdrop, became part of the visual mythology. A thoughtful leader rocking gently in coastal light. The house framed him perfectly. Rose Kennedy thrived in this period. Her son was president. Visitors sought her presence. She attended Mass in Hyannis Village, and parishioners watched with reverence. For decades she had managed the compound quietly. Now she stood at the centre of its vindication. Joe Sr., however, would not fully experience it. In December 1961, he suffered a devastating stroke while in Palm Beach. He survived, but partially paralysed, his speech severely impaired. He returned to Hyannis Port in a wheelchair. The architect of the Dynasty could now only observe it. Staff positioned him on the porch where he could watch arrivals. Watch his son, the president. Watch grandchildren playing. Watch the world entering the gates he had once forced open. He could see the culmination, but he could not command it. The house had shifted hierarchy again. Joe was no longer the driving force inside it. John and Robert filled that role. The brothers used Hyannis Port strategically. Private conversations about Cuba, about civil rights, about Vietnam, major national decisions discussed within walls that once hosted sibling rivalries. The dining room transformed. No longer tribunal of children, now war room of a presidency. And yet the house carried a strange duality. On the lawn, children still ran. Caroline played near the water. John Jr., small and curious, toddled under Secret Service watch. The Atlantic wind remained unchanged. Hyannis Port looked the same. But its meaning had expanded beyond family. It now belonged to America. Tourists gathered outside the gates hoping to glimpse history. Local businesses thrived from presidential presence. The once resistant Cape Cod establishment now took pride in hosting the first Catholic president's summer retreat. The outsider had become centerpiece. Joe's original vision, legitimacy through location, had worked. Hyannis Port had rewritten social boundaries. But peak power is rarely stable. It carries its own fragility. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to nuclear brink. Hyannis Port felt tension even in summer air. Security tightened. Conversations grew more serious. The porch no longer symbolized leisure alone. It symbolized responsibility. John still sailed when he could. Out on the water, away from telephones and advisors, he found fragments of quiet. But even there, Secret Service followed in escort boats. The president was never fully alone. The house had achieved its ultimate role. It was no longer just Kennedy headquarters. It was a national monument. But monuments are vulnerable, because they represent concentrated expectation. Hyannis Port had witnessed ambition, rebellion, silence, death. Now it witnessed triumph. And triumph, when elevated too high, often precedes descent. In the summer of 1963, the compound glowed. Family gathered. Laughter returned in waves. John played with his children. Robert visited frequently. Ted was rising politically. The dynasty appeared secure again. From the porch, Joe watched in partial silence. He could see everything he had built. The presidency, the legacy, the house alive with purpose. But architecture remembers balance. For every preserved bedroom, for every empty chair, for every recalibration, there is reckoning. Hyannis Port stood radiant against the Atlantic sky. The summer White House, Camelot by the sea. No one inside it knew that within months it would no longer symbolize ascent, it would symbolize mourning. And the porch that framed optimism would soon frame grief. The house was at its brightest, which meant it was closest to darkness. On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, Hyannis Port was quiet. Summer crowds were gone. The air had turned sharper. The Atlantic rolled in muted grey against the shoreline. The compound, which had hosted presidents and foreign leaders just weeks earlier, stood nearly still. John Kennedy was in Texas. Jacqueline was with him. The house by the sea was no longer the centre of activity. It was waiting. At St. Francis Xavier Church in Hyannis, Rose Kennedy attended morning mass. It was routine. It was discipline. Faith had become structure in her life, a steady rhythm against chaos she did not yet know. Back at the compound, televisions flickered on. In Washington, Senator Ted Kennedy was on the Senate floor when an aide rushed in with urgent news. Shots fired in Dallas. In Hyannis Port, staff gathered around radios. Confusion, rumors, contradictory reports, then confirmation. The president had been shot. Minutes passed like hours, then the words, "No house is built to hear. The president is dead." The message reached Rose by phone. She returned to the compound, her face composed, her faith intact. This was the third son she had lost, Joseph Jr., and now John. The porch that once framed presidential confidence now framed paralysis. Joe Kennedy, partially paralyzed from his stroke, watched the coverage from inside the house. He could understand everything. He could barely speak. Witnesses later recalled his face collapsing inward, silent, distorted grief unable to form words. The architect of the dynasty could not command this moment. He could only observe its destruction. Hyannis Port transformed instantly. Security intensified. Reporters flooded the town. Satellite trucks lined the streets. The gates that once symbolized status now symbolized tragedy. The house that had been the summer White House became a site of national mourning. The rocking chair on the porch, once icon of calm leadership, now stood empty. Images of the chair circulated in newspapers across the world. Absence became symbol. Jackie returned to Massachusetts after the funeral. Not immediately, but eventually. She walked the lawn where her husband once played football with his brothers. She stood on the dock where he had sailed. Hyannis Port did not comfort her. It magnified loss. Every room carried memory. Every corner contained echo. The dining room where policy had been debated now felt hollow. The upstairs bedrooms felt smaller. Even the Atlantic seemed quieter. The compound that had projected vitality now felt exposed. Because success had never truly erased the earlier fractures. Rosemary, Joe Jr., Kick, now John. The house had not been cursed. It had been accumulating absence, accumulating silence. The public narrative framed John's presidency as Camelot, youthful, luminous, romantic. Hyannis Port had been its visual backdrop. Now Camelot ended not in glory but in gunfire. And the compound bore the emotional consequence. Robert Kennedy stepped into a new role immediately. Grief did not pause responsibility. He was now not only Attorney General, he was guardian of his brother's legacy. He walked the same porch, sat in the same rooms, but the atmosphere had changed. He was no longer advisor, he was survivor. The younger children sensed it too. Caroline was old enough to understand confusion. John Jr. was too young to remember fully, but the house remembered for him. Joe Kennedy never fully recovered emotionally. His stroke had silenced him physically. Now grief silenced him spiritually. He lived until 1969, but the man who built the dynasty had watched 2 sons die and a third fall to assassination. Hyannis Port became quieter in the years after Dallas. Not empty, but altered. Family still gathered, football games resumed, but joy had restraint. Because once a house has witnessed public execution of its brightest figure, it cannot return to innocence. The compound no longer symbolized triumph, it symbolized fragility. Tourists still came, photographs were still taken. But something had shifted beneath the white siding. The Atlantic remained indifferent. Waves continued their rhythm. The wind moved through shutters as it always had. But Hyannis Port now held a different energy. It was no longer just the house that built a president. It was the house that survived him, and survival carries weight. The dynasty did not end in 1963. It recalibrated again. Ted would rise. Robert would pursue his own path. The family name remained powerful, but the illusion of invincibility was gone. Hyannis Port stood as witness to the moment the myth fractured. The day the house went dark, and darkness, once entered, rarely leaves completely. While Hyannis Port absorbed the weight of Dallas, another Kennedy estate carried its own rhythm of life and illusion. Hickory Hill in McLean, Virginia, had never been meant to be a symbol. It was not purchased by Joe Sr. as part of a grand social strategy. It was not chosen for old money proximity or coastal prestige. It became Robert Kennedy's home almost by accident. John had first bought the property in the mid-1950s. The estate sat on wooded land overlooking the Potomac River, large, historic, expansive, but Jacqueline disliked it. Too isolated, too imposing, too distant from Washington's center. Robert and Ethel embraced it instead, and what they created inside Hickory Hill could not have been more different from Hyannis Port. If the Cape compound was discipline and hierarchy, Hickory Hill was noise and abundance, children everywhere, animals everywhere, broken windows, laughter echoing down long hallways. Ethel Kennedy did not run her household like Rose. She allowed chaos, encouraged it. 11 children would eventually fill that house. Horses roamed the grounds, dogs darted through rooms. At one point, even a sea lion reportedly occupied the pool for a brief impractical experiment. The estate felt alive in a way Hyannis Port rarely allowed. Robert, who had grown up under the shadow of competition, created something softer here. He still believed in service, still believed in ambition, but he did not replicate his father's severity. At Hickory Hill, children climbed trees without performance being measured. Games were loud but less calculated. Failure did not carry the same silent punishment. The dining table was crowded, but not interrogative, yet even this house could not fully escape the gravitational pull of the dynasty. Because Robert was still a Kennedy. When John became president, Robert became Attorney General. The estate transformed into political nerve centre almost overnight. Meetings filled the library. Strategy sessions unfolded late into the night. Advisors stepped over toys on their way to policy discussions. The personal and political blended completely. The house that tried to feel different still served the same machine. Hickory Hill became gathering place for extended family. After Dallas, it became refuge for Robert in particular. He walked its grounds alone. He sat by the pool long after children went to bed. Grief at Hickory Hill felt different than at Hyannis. Less ceremonial, more internal. Robert changed after 1963. His intensity sharpened. His moral compass became more pronounced. Civil rights, poverty, Vietnam. He seemed less interested in inherited power and more interested in purpose. Some historians believe Dallas radicalized him. Hickory Hill bore witness to that transformation. He read late into the night in his study, met with activists, considered political futures independent of his father's blueprint. For the first time, a Kennedy son was pursuing direction that felt self-generated rather than engineered. And yet the shadow followed. In 1968, Robert decided to run for president. The campaign energized the country. It felt like revival, like possibility, like the dynasty had found moral direction. Hickory Hill buzzed again with political energy. Children watched from staircases as reporters gathered. Ethel moved through rooms balancing domestic life and national attention. The estate felt hopeful. But hope inside Kennedy architecture had a pattern. On June 5, 1968, after winning the California Democratic primary, Robert Kennedy was shot in Los Angeles. He died the following day. Another telegram, another son, another recalibration. Hickory Hill, the house that tried to escape the pattern, now carried its own memorial weight. Robert's study remained as he left it. Books stacked carefully, notes mid-thought. The pool where he had thrown guests playfully now reflected silence. Ethel was pregnant with their 11th child when he died. The estate filled again with grief. But this time the grief felt different. It was not simply loss of a son. It was loss of possibility. The house that had symbolized warmth now symbolized unfinished promise. Hyannis Port had witnessed ambition. Palm Beach had witnessed image. Hickory Hill had tried to witness humanity. But humanity does not protect against mortality. The pattern intensified. Rosemary institutionalized. Joe Jr. killed in war. Kit killed in plane crash. John assassinated. Robert assassinated. The architecture could not stop it. It could only absorb it. Joe Sr. died in 1969. The patriarch never fully spoke again after his stroke. He built 3 estates. He watched 5 children vanish. Hickory Hill remained filled with children and grandchildren. Life continued. But the narrative of invincibility was gone. The house that tried to feel different had proven something devastating. Even warmth cannot rewrite fate. Even love cannot neutralize history. The Kennedy estates were not cursed. They were constructed around extraordinary expectation. An extraordinary expectation magnifies consequence. Hickory Hill eventually left Kennedy hands decades later. But during its era, it represented something fragile. The idea that the dynasty could evolve, that it could soften, that it could become more human. History interrupted that experiment, and the Potomac flowed past the estate quietly, indifferent, as always. After 1968, the silence inside Hyannis Port changed again. Not the sharp silence of shock, not the raw silence of fresh grief, but a heavier one, the silence of repetition. By then, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Rosemary gone to an institution, Joe Jr. lost in war, Kick lost in the Alps, John assassinated, Robert assassinated. The compound had outlived 5 of Joe and Rose's 9 children, and now the younger son remained in the spotlight, Edward Kennedy, Ted. He had grown up watching the older brothers absorb expectation. He had lived inside Hyannis Port during its transformation from laboratory to presidential palace to memorial site. He understood what the house represented, and he understood the burden it carried. After Robert's death, Ted became the political standard-bearer of the family. He was not the eldest, he was not the most charismatic, but he was the last viable heir to the dynasty Joe had engineered. Hyannis Port shifted its focus once more. The dining table that had once trained Joe Jr., then reoriented toward John, then toward Robert, now turned toward Ted. The house did not speak, but its memory pressed inward. Ted entered the Senate at a young age. He carried the name. He carried the sympathy of a grieving nation, and he carried something more dangerous, expectation without protection. Because by the late 1960s, the myth of Kennedy invincibility had cracked. The public loved the family, but it also watched them, closely. In July 1969, just weeks after the moon landing, Ted attended a party on Chappaquiddick Island, not far from Hyannis Port. It was meant to be private, a gathering of friends and former campaign staff. Late that night, Ted drove his car off a narrow bridge into dark water. His passenger, Mary Jo Kopechny, drowned. Ted survived. The accident was immediately controversial. The delay in reporting it, the unanswered questions, the appearance of privilege shielding accountability. For the first time, the Kennedy name did not represent tragedy imposed from outside. It represented scandal from within. Hyannis Port absorbed that shift. The compound that had endured war, plane crashes, assassinations, events beyond its control, now faced something different. Human error, moral failure, public distrust. The house that had been stage for Camelot now hosted defensive strategy meetings. Ted's future was suddenly uncertain. Presidential hopes dimmed. The dynasty's forward momentum slowed. Rose Kennedy, already weathered by decades of loss, responded with familiar faith, prayer, routine, endurance. Joe Sr. was gone by then, dead in 1969. He did not witness Chappaquiddick, but his architecture did. Hyannis Port held the tension of it. For the first time, the house felt not only tragic but tarnished. The pattern had evolved. Death had once strengthened sympathy. Now controversy weakened mystique. Ted remained in the Senate for decades. He became influential in legislation, civil rights, healthcare, education. He carved out legacy separate from presidency. But Hyannis Port never again carried the same upward energy. It felt older, heavier, its white siding weathered by more than an Atlantic wind. Visitors still came, tourists still drove past the gates, but the narrative had shifted. The compound was no longer seen as engine of destiny. It was seen as symbol of a bygone era. Camelot had ended. The children of the next generation grew up within its boundaries. Caroline, John Jr., Robert's many children. They inherited not only property, but myth, and myth is heavy. In 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr., the small boy once photographed saluting his father's coffin, died in a plane crash off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. Another Kennedy, another aircraft, another body lost to water. Hyannis Port felt it deeply, because this time the tragedy felt cyclical, a generation removed, yet hauntingly familiar. The house that had once been laboratory now resembled mausoleum. The Atlantic remained unchanged, but the compound seemed to breathe differently. The laughter of earlier decades echoed faintly against its walls. By the early 2000s, many of the original children were gone. Rose Kennedy died in 1995 at 104. She had outlived nearly all her children. She had outlived the myth. The house remained. The architecture endured. But dynasties do not last through walls alone. They require energy, and energy had been depleted. Hyannis Port still hosted family gatherings, but no one at the table carried Joe's original presidential blueprint with the same intensity. The house had witnessed ambition at maximum voltage. It had witnessed grief at catastrophic scale. It had witnessed scandal and redemption and repetition. Now it witnessed aging, quiet continuity, a family no longer climbing, simply existing. An existence feels different inside a house built for ascent. By the early 21st century, the Kennedy compound in Hyannis Port no longer felt like the engine of a dynasty. It felt like a reliquary. The three houses still stood on their 6 acres of waterfront land, white clapboard, green shutters, porches facing Nantucket Sound just as they had in 1928. From a distance, nothing appeared altered, but inside, time had reorganized everything. The original children were gone, some buried, some institutionalized, some taken by age, some taken by violence. The rooms that once held ambition now held memory. The main house still contained the dining room where Joe had interrogated his children into political sharpness. The table had changed, the chairs replaced over decades, but the space retained its architecture of scrutiny. It was difficult to sit there without sensing hierarchy. Even grandchildren felt it. They inherited not just a property, but atmosphere. Photographs lined the hallways, formal portraits of senators, presidents, attorneys general, smiling images from summer days, football games frozen mid-motion, sailing regattas under bright Cape skies. But photographs preserve illusion better than they preserve context. They did not show Rosemary's absence. They did not show Joe Jr.'s preserved bedroom. They did not show the night Ted drove off a bridge. They did not show Rose weeping privately after Dallas. The house remembered what the frames omitted. Hyannis Port became pilgrimage site. Political figures visited as if stepping into American mythology. Journalists referenced it whenever discussing the family. It became shorthand. Hyannis Port meant legacy. It meant old ambition wrapped in coastal elegance. But the younger generation experienced it differently. For them, it was not laboratory. It was inheritance, and inheritance is quieter. Carolyn Kennedy, the president's daughter, returned often. She walked the same lawn where her father once ran. She stood on the same dock where he once sailed. But she did not carry Joe Sr.'s blueprint. She carried history. Robert's children, raised at Hickory Hill, brought their own energy when they visited. Laughter returned in bursts, but it felt episodic, not structural. The compound had lost its forward momentum. It was no longer manufacturing candidates, it was maintaining narrative. Over time, portions of the estate were sold or restructured. Some of the original houses changed hands within the family. Maintenance became complex, taxes high. The realities of modern property ownership intruded on romantic mythology. The compound that once symbolized ascent now symbolized endurance, and endurance is less glamorous than conquest. Architecturally, Hyannis Port aged gracefully. The siding weathered into softer tones. The Atlantic breeze wore edges smooth. Storms came and went. The houses stood. But culturally, the energy shifted outward. The Kennedy name remained significant in American politics, but not dominant. The presidency had passed to others. The Senate belonged to new generations. The era of concentrated family power dissolved into broader political landscapes. Hyannis Port transitioned from power center to memory site, and memory can be deceptive. Visitors often imagined Camelot, sunlit optimism, youthful presidents sailing. But the house knew more than that. It had heard the sobs after midnight phone calls. It had absorbed the shock of telegrams. It had seen the patriarch reduced to silence in a wheelchair on the porch. It had felt the tremor of national tragedy ripple through its walls. It had watched as ambition demanded sacrifice again and again. The compound outlived Joe's certainty. It outlived Rose's faith. It outlived the myth of invincibility, but it could not outlive its own narrative. Because architecture built for performance carries imprint. Even when rooms are repainted, even when furniture is replaced, the psychological blueprint remains. Hyannis Port had been designed as centralization, control, proximity, visibility. It had functioned exactly as intended. It had held the family together, but holding together also meant concentrating consequence. When tragedy struck one, it struck all. And the house amplified it. In later years, interviews with surviving Kennedys often returned to the compound. Memories of football games, of laughter, of fierce debates. But between lines, something else appeared. Recognition. Recognition that the pressure had been real, that the expectations had been immense, that greatness had been demanded, not simply hoped for. The house had given them opportunity, but it had also demanded output. It had rewarded performance. It had concealed weakness. It had enforced image. Now it stood quieter, not empty, but softened. The grandchildren did not compete with the same ferocity. The dinner table no longer functioned as tribunal. The lawn no longer hosted games where hierarchy was measured. The Atlantic still moved, but the dynasty no longer surged with it. Hyannis Port became something more reflective, a house that had fulfilled its purpose and survived its consequences. But survival is not the same as triumph. The dream Joe stood on the porch envisioning in 1928, an unbroken American aristocracy, had fractured. The presidency had come, twice within the family, but permanence had not. Instead, the compound inherited something more complicated. Legacy without continuity, fame without centrality, history without forward charge. And in that transition, Hyannis Port revealed its final truth. Houses can build power, but they cannot preserve destiny. They can centralize ambition, but they cannot prevent mortality. They can frame triumph, but they cannot hold it indefinitely. The rooms that once trained leaders now hosted remembrance, and remembrance is quieter than ambition. In 1928, Joseph Kennedy stood on the porch of his newly purchased compound in Hyannis Port and imagined permanence. He did not imagine fragility. He did not imagine silence. He imagined continuity. 3 houses on 6 acres of waterfront land, a centralized dynasty. Children who would never drift too far. Power rooted in architecture. He believed environment could engineer destiny. And for a time, it seemed he was right. The compound produced a president, a senator, an attorney general, national figures whose names reshaped American politics. Hyannis Port became symbol. Palm Beach became theatre. Hickory Hill became warmth. Together they formed an empire of image. But image cannot outpace mortality. The houses were built to hold success. They were not designed to contain accumulation of grief. Yet they did. Rosemary's vanished bedroom, Joe Jr.'s preserved trophies, Kic's empty chair, John's rocking chair, Robert's unfinished notes, Ted's scandal, John Jr.'s final flight. Every estate absorbed its share. Palm Beach watched the patriarch lose his voice. Hyannis Port watched the dynasty peak and break. Hickory Hill tried to soften the pattern and joined it. The narrative of the Kennedy curse would later circulate in newspapers and documentaries. But curses are mystical explanations for structural pressure. The Kennedy estates were not haunted. They were concentrated. Concentrated ambition. Concentrated expectation. Concentrated visibility. When power is centralized so intensely, consequences concentrate too. The houses did not cause tragedy. They amplified its impact. They gathered every rise and every fall under one roof. They refused dispersion, and that refusal created mythology. Standing today along Nantucket Sound, the compound looks unchanged. The Atlantic still presses rhythmically against the shore. The clapboard still catches sunlight in soft white reflection. The porch still faces the horizon. Visitors who pass by see elegance. They see Camelot. They see American royalty frozen in coastal light. But the house remembers something more complicated. It remembers the pressure in the dining room, the moment Joe Jr.'s telegram was unfolded, the silence after Dallas, the wheelchair on the porch, the late-night strategy sessions, the whispered recalibrations after scandal. The house remembers that ambition is loud, but loss is louder. Palm Beach still stands on North Ocean Boulevard, Mediterranean arches glowing in warm Florida light, but beneath its stucco facade it remembers winter conversations about control. It remembers image crafted deliberately. It remembers Joe's final years reduced to quiet observation. Hickory Hill no longer belongs to the Kennedys, but its memory holds laughter that tried to outrun tragedy. It holds a pool once filled with children, and later filled with mourning. The estates outlived their architects. They outlived the era of concentrated Kennedy dominance. What remains is not curse, not conspiracy, but lesson. Architecture can centralize ambition. It can frame legitimacy. It can project permanence, but it cannot protect against human vulnerability. Joe Kennedy built proximity into his dynasty. He believed proximity meant strength. He kept children close. He kept decisions centralized. He kept identity tied to place. And in doing so, he ensured that every triumph and every catastrophe would reverberate through the same walls. The compound was never neutral, it was active, it shaped identity, it shaped rivalry, it shaped expectation, but it could not shape fate. In the end, the mansions remain. The Atlantic continues its indifferent rhythm. The wind moves through shutters as it did nearly a century ago. But the dynasty that once seemed unstoppable is now memory. Hyannis Port stands not as proof of invincibility, but as evidence of complexity. It tells a story of ambition achieved and ambition exceeded, of image mastered and image shattered, of power centralized and vulnerability exposed. The house that was meant to manufacture permanence instead became archive, an archive of American aspiration and American fragility. Joe believed he was building an American aristocracy. He succeeded, briefly. But aristocracies built on performance rather than inheritance must constantly reprove themselves. The pressure never ends, and pressure leaves imprint. If you stand on the lawn today, facing the Atlantic, you might still imagine children running across the grass. You might picture a president sailing into bright summer light. You might feel the echo of touch football games and debate at the dining table. But beneath those echoes lies something quieter, a recognition that greatness demands cost, that ambition demands sacrifice, and that houses, no matter how beautiful, cannot protect those who inhabit them from the weight of their own expectations. The Kennedy estates were not cursed. They were constructed around extraordinary intensity. An intensity sustained for generations burns. The houses remain, but the dream they were built to guarantee has faded into history. What survives is not dynasty, it is memory. And memory, unlike power, does not need to compete. It simply endures.